Chinese ships are flooding America. U.S. companies are panicking, and prices are crashing. That sounds like a headline, but in 2026, it's a chain reaction you can actually map step by step from factory gates in China to American balance sheets. Because what's happening right now isn't trade tension, it's a market rupture. A system that used to run on predictable rules is turning into logistics warfare. And the weird part is this: America is importing less from China directly, but China is exporting more than any country in human history. That's the first clue that the great decoupling didn't work the way everyone thought. So in this video, I'm going to show you the real mechanism behind the flood, the panic, and the crash. Not vibes, not politics, the plumbing. Here's the big picture in one sentence. As 2026 begins, three once-in-a-century events are colliding at the same time: a failed decoupling, a logistics Cold War, and a sector-by-sector deflation shock. And when those three hit together, you get exactly what you're seeing now: too many ships, too much inventory, and prices falling in places nobody expected. Let's start with the paradox that makes the flood possible. In 2025, U.S. imports from China fell 28% year over year. In December 2025 alone, imports were running 34% below the prior year, with no real recovery signal. U.S. exports to China fell 38% for the year. So on paper, that looks like decoupling. But in reality, China didn't slow down, it redirected. China posted a record global trade surplus of $1.2 trillion in 2025, up from $993 billion in 2024. That is a historic number. And total Chinese exports still grew 5.5% even with U.S. hostility. So where did the volume go? It surged into third-party markets. Africa up 26%, Southeast Asia up 13%, European Union up 8.4%, Latin America up 7.4%. That is the displacement effect. You block the front door, the water finds another way in. And this is where the flood becomes physical. Chinese factories are operating under producer price deflation, negative PPI, for 11 consecutive quarters. That means goods are leaving factories at rock-bottom prices, not because manufacturers are feeling generous, because they're under pressure. Domestic consumption is weak, the property sector is stressed, and export-led growth becomes survival. So now you have a global surplus trying to escape, and it escapes through routing tricks. Transshipment hubs explode. 2025 data shows major surges in U.S. imports from Vietnam, Thailand, and other Southeast Asian channels, consistent with Chinese components being shipped out, lightly processed, then relabeled for entry. And then there's the Mexican backdoor. China uses Mexico as a staging ground, leveraging access rules, which is why the U.S. started threatening reciprocal tariffs and crackdowns on Mexican imports containing Chinese components. That's the first force: redirected overcapacity. Now here's the second force: logistics warfare. This is the part most people miss because they think the fight is about tariffs. But the panic isn't only about tariffs, it's about the supply chain itself being weaponized. In October 2025, the U.S. Trade Representative concluded a Section 301 investigation and labeled China's shipbuilding dominance, over 50% of global output compared to the U.S. at about 0.1%, as an unreasonable trade practice. Then the U.S. dropped a bomb on shipping, a port fee structure that on paper was simple. In practice, it was nuclear. $1 million per port call for vessels operated by Chinese companies, $1.5 million per port call for vessels built in China, regardless of who operates them. Read that again: built in China, regardless of nationality. That's why it triggered instant panic, because a huge portion of the global fleet, even for non-Chinese operators, is Chinese-built. So this wasn't just punish China. This threatened to hit basically everyone touching U.S. ports. Retailers panicked, not because they loved China, because they feared holiday inventory would be stranded or become millions more expensive per voyage.
And China retaliated immediately with special port fees on U.S.-owned, U.S.-operated, and U.S.-built vessels, plus sanctions on a U.S. subsidiary of a South Korean shipbuilder. Then, in November 2025, the system blinked. A Trump-Xi meeting produced a fragile truce. The U.S. suspended those port fees for 1 year, until November 10, 2026. China suspended its retaliatory fees and lifted the sanctions. So the crisis was paused. But here's why U.S. companies are still panicking in January 2026. Because the infrastructure for those fees still exists. It's like living under a guillotine with a timer. If you're a retailer, you cannot sign long-term freight contracts confidently when you know that in November 2026, shipping costs could jump by $1 million per call. That single date creates volatility across the whole logistics stack, and that volatility creates behavior. Companies start front-loading inventory because they're terrified of the next shock. That is panic buying. But the moment the fear shifts, that inventory becomes a problem because it has to clear, and clearing is where prices crash. Now for the third force, the deflation shock. Trade wars usually make people fear inflation, more tariffs, higher prices, right?
But what we're seeing here is sectoral deflation, specific goods categories collapsing in price because Chinese overcapacity is colliding with Western protectionism. The result is not uniform. Services can stay sticky, but tradable goods get hammered. You can see it in the raw inputs first. Lithium prices crashed from over $4,000 per ton in 2022 to under $1,000 per ton in 2026. That is a deflationary signal rippling through batteries, EV supply chains, and anything tied to electrification. And it shows up downstream in the used EV market. Used EV prices in the U.S. are crashing faster than internal combustion equivalents, driven by rapid tech obsolescence and the liquidation of rental fleets. Now add a new element, vertical integration in shipping. Chinese firms are not just exporting products, they are building the pipes to export them. A critical development in 2025-2026 is the emergence of state-backed corporations creating their own logistics networks. BYD is the cleanest example. BYD commissioned its own fleet of RORO car carriers. BYD Explorer #1 and its sister ships are delivering thousands of EVs directly to ports in Europe, Mexico, and South America. That is the flood of ships in the most literal sense. By owning the ships, exporters insulate themselves from Western shipping alliances and capacity restrictions. They can flood a market like Mexico with vehicles even if a global carrier limits space. And because they control logistics, they can hold overseas prices lower longer, which forces everyone else to respond. Even with 100% tariffs, the threat of cheap Chinese EVs entering through assembly in Mexico and other staging locations pressures U.S. automakers to cut prices to defend market share. And when OEMs cut prices, margins get crushed, so you get a deflation shock in a sector everyone assumed would be protected. Now look at solar. This is where panic becomes existential. Chinese solar manufacturers facing a domestic slowdown flooded global markets with modules so cheap they dropped below the cash cost of production for Western firms. This isn't gentle competition, it's devastation. And policy uncertainty makes it worse. In mid-2025, legislation known as the One Big Beautiful Bill was proposed and enacted in July 2025. It retained some manufacturing credits, but phased out buyer tax credits earlier than the previous framework. So the industry gets hit from both sides, cheap imports crushing prices and policy uncertainty reducing demand confidence. The Solar Energy Industries Association forecasts 88,000 job losses in 2026 from this combination. Solar stocks reflected the fear. Companies like Enphase, Sunrun, and SolarEdge suffered sharp single-session drops, roughly in the 20 to 27% range, because markets priced in a future where they can't compete with imported panels. And here's how brutal the price war is. Even Chinese solar firms laid off about 1/3 of their workforce in 2025. When even the low-cost producer is cutting that hard, you know this is not normal competition. It's an overcapacity purge. Now zoom back to shipping. Here's the paradox everyone hates. The risk is high, but freight rates are crashing. In January 2026, ocean spot rates to the U.S. West Coast fell to about $1,400 per FEU. Why? Demand collapse. U.S. import volumes are down 28%, so ships are sailing partially empty. At the same time, there's a capacity glut. A flood of new ships ordered during the COVID years of 2021 to 2022 is now being delivered, so you get structural overcapacity. Carriers start slashing rates to capture whatever volume exists, a race to the bottom. That's what a price crash looks like in logistics. And it creates a second-order effect, because lower freight costs make it even easier to dump goods into a market, so you get more inventory pressure, more liquidation, more deflation. Now, while all this is happening, the geopolitical accelerant shows up. In January 2026, panic increases because trade volatility expands beyond China. The Greenland crisis. The U.S. administration attempted to purchase Greenland. Denmark refused, and that triggered tariff threats, initially 10%, rising to 25% against 8 European nations: Denmark, the UK, Germany, France, Sweden, Norway, the Netherlands, and Finland. The EU called an emergency meeting and threatened to deploy its anti-coercion instrument, basically a retaliatory sanctions tool. This matters because it creates the corporate nightmare, whack-a-mole risk. If your company spent years shifting supply chains away from China to safe alternatives like Europe, and now Europe becomes a target, you lose the ability to plan. Multinationals warned that volatility makes accurate pricing impossible, because you could be facing a trade war with China, the factory, and Europe, the ally, at the same time. That's how you get corporate panic, even while prices are crashing. Because price crashing doesn't mean safety, it means instability. It means you're clearing a mess. Now the flood has one more layer: enforcement crackdowns. When direct routes close, shadow supply chains open. Transshipment through Vietnam and Thailand surged, consistent with minimal processing and relabeling to bypass tariffs. But by January 2026, the U.S. launched enforcement against country of origin fraud. New customs requirements and potential tariffs on Vietnam slowed flows, creating delays at ports and increasing importer anxiety. So, companies get squeezed again. You can't rely on the old routes, you can't rely on the loopholes, and you can't sign long-term contracts because of the November 2026 cliff. That's why boardrooms are panicking, not because goods are expensive, because the rules are unstable. Now, let's make this real with a micro example people can picture: the boat market. Because this same pattern, Chinese manufacturing flooding, U.S. brands panicking, prices collapsing, shows up clearly in recreational boats. Chinese boat manufacturers are entering American marinas and dealerships with prices that look impossible. The headline number driving the shock is simple: boats selling for roughly 40% less than American brands. A 19-foot aluminum fishing boat from a traditional American brand typically retails between $28,000 and $35,000, and that's before you add the outboard motor, trailer, and electronics. Comparable boats from Chinese manufacturers show up at about $17,000 to $22,000, fully equipped with similar features. That's not a modest discount. That changes who can afford to buy a boat, and it pressures the entire entry-level segment. This didn't happen overnight. Chinese manufacturers started studying the American recreational boat market around 10 years ago and noticed something American builders had stopped paying attention to. The entry-level buyer was disappearing. American companies moved up market, chasing premium features and higher margins. During that period, the average price of a new fishing boat in America doubled between 2010 and 2023. That left an open lane. Chinese builders entered quietly around 2015 through smaller regional dealers, looking for budget options. Early reception was mixed. Quality control issues, questionable welds, components that didn't hold up in salt water, warranty headaches. So the industry consensus was cheap for a reason. Then, around 2019, something changed. Chinese manufacturers invested heavily in quality control. They hired engineers from American and European boat companies. They upgraded manufacturing processes. Welds got cleaner, components got better, fit and finish improved dramatically. Modern Chinese boats from established manufacturers began meeting or exceeding standards used by the American Marine Standards Association. And the strategic move wasn't only manufacturing, it was distribution. Chinese manufacturers figured out the dealer network. Instead of trying to fight head-to-head inside traditional legacy dealerships, they targeted independent dealers, RV dealers expanding into boats, and online retailers.
They offered attractive dealer margins, fast shipping, and minimal order quantities. For dealers struggling with slow-moving American inventory and high carrying costs, Chinese boats became a viable alternative. That's how you get flooding, not just through ports, through channels. Now, why can they be so cheap? Yes, labor costs matter. A welder in China earns a fraction of a U.S. welder. Overhead is lower, regulation is lighter, materials can be cheaper. But the bigger structural advantages are scale and integration. A factory in a Chinese hub might produce 50,000 boats per year across multiple models. Compare that to an American builder producing 5,000 annually. That volume means better component pricing on aluminum, fiberglass, hardware, and electronics. Then vertical integration stacks on top. A Chinese manufacturer might own the aluminum extrusion facility, the upholstery shop, and the trailer manufacturing. American builders often outsource those components, adding markup at every step. Then there's currency. The yuan is kept weaker than the dollar, making exports cheaper. And government support plays a role. Subsidies and strategic backing exist in ways American companies don't get. So the price gap becomes structural, not a temporary sale. Are Chinese boats good? The honest answer is nuanced. Functionally, a basic aluminum fishing boat from China and a basic one from America share similar gauges of aluminum and similar construction techniques. They'll both float, they'll both get you across the lake. Differences show up in details. American boats typically use thicker aluminum in high-stress areas. Weld consistency is often better. Hardware can be more corrosion-resistant, and American-built boats may include design touches optimized for American use, like storage sized for American tackle or live well designs tuned to American fishing styles. Chinese boats sometimes miss those tiny details. Cup holders in odd places, storage configured strangely, electrical systems using metric components that can be harder to service locally. Not deal breakers for everyone, but experienced owners notice. The biggest uncertainty is durability track record. American builders have decades of data on how their boats handle saltwater, winters, and hard use. Chinese manufacturers are still building that track record in American conditions. A 5-year-old Chinese boat might be fine. A 15-year-old Chinese boat? The data set isn't there yet. Then there's service. If something breaks on an American boat, service centers know the brand, parts are available, and mechanics are familiar. With Chinese boats, service networks can be thinner, parts may take weeks, and local mechanics may not know the specific components.
That matters a lot more once you move from simple boats to complex ones loaded with electronics, hydraulics, and specialized systems. Now, watch what happens to U.S. brands. Companies like Brunswick and Tracker are watching entry-level sales collapse and market share erode in segments they dominated for decades. The response splits into two strategies. One, try to compete on value by cutting costs and simplifying entry-level models. Two, double down on premium features and American-made marketing. Neither is clean because U.S. cost structures are hard to change. Union labor contracts, expensive facilities, legacy pension obligations, regulatory compliance. Even if an American company wants to match Chinese prices, they can't without losing money on every unit. So, a third strategy appears.
outsource manufacturing. Some brands have already moved production to China while keeping American brand names. You get American logos on Chinese boats, and the dealer network becomes the battlefield. Dealers are stuck between loyalty to American suppliers and the reality that customers want affordable boats. So, dealers add Chinese brands. Some drop American brands entirely. And this shift starts at entry level, under $30,000, where Chinese options become everywhere. Premium boats over $75,000 still lean American, but Chinese manufacturers are moving up market, building larger and more complex boats. So the divide is not permanent, it's just the current line of pressure. Tariffs add complexity. The U.S. imposed tariffs on Chinese boats ranging roughly from 7.5% to 25%, depending on type and manufacturing date, designed to protect American manufacturers. But even with tariffs, Chinese boats remain significantly cheaper in practice. So tariffs slow the flood, they don't stop it. And that brings us back to the macro picture. This is the new system, a flood of overcapacity trying to escape, a logistics war that makes rules unstable, and a deflation shock in goods sectors where China's pricing power is strongest. The final twist is the future risk, because the real cliff is November 10th, 2026. That's when the suspension on million-dollar port fees expires. If those fees return without a permanent deal, Trans-Pacific logistics could slam into a hard stop, which could mean shortages and recession risk in the U.S. and export collapse depression risk in China. So, yes, ships are flooding in. Yes, companies are panicking. Yes, prices are crashing, but what's underneath is bigger. The death of just-in-time, the end of efficiency as the dominant strategy, and the beginning of a bifurcated global economy, where supply chains are built for resilience, not perfection. And that transition is messy, because the flood you're seeing isn't healthy growth.
It's distressed volume escaping a system under pressure. And when distressed volume hits a market that's already full, the only thing that can give is price.